FY26. Thank you so much for joining us. Just a few things as we get started. We want to be sure that you're aware of the team who's here and present. You all have a regional program manager that you work directly with, but your regional program manager also has an area of focus or a title specialist, as we've referred to them. So we just wanted to provide that information for you folks here. Many of our teammates are joining us today and will be sharing content for all of us in relation to the title-specific expertise that they come with. But again, every SAU has a regional program manager, and the regional program manager is your point of contact when anything related to ESEA federal programs is discussed. As I alluded to, there's a few housekeeping things that we want to draw your attention to. The presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website. We do ask that you keep your microphone muted during the presentation. We will open up the floor for questions and answers. Our team is also monitoring the chat box, so we encourage you to put questions there. Anything specific we will address within the chat box. And we will also open up the floor during our demo after our demo for some questions. One item that I also mentioned before we were recording is, if you don't mind renaming yourself using your first and last name and your SAU, that will help us take a look at attendance and be sure that we're providing resources to the SAUs who have been identified as medium and or high in our FY26 monitoring process. So the Maine Department of Education is responsible for the oversight and monitoring of programs and activities carried out under ESEA. There is some provisions under the General Education Provision Act, and we adopt and use a process to administer and monitor agencies like yourselves, the SAU or the subrecipient, as may be referred to in our PowerPoint today. We, as an ESEA Federal Programs Team at the Maine Department of Education, has adopted a consolidated approach to monitoring, which means when we monitor within ESEA Federal Programs, we are monitoring for all titles 1 through 5, which are applicable at the local level for particular schools and SAUs. We wanted to talk a little bit about how schools are selected, how SAUs are selected for monitoring and are identified as medium and high. So we use 20 indicators that we review every year for every single SAU. These indicators encompass characteristics such as size, funding level, and staff turnover, key submission and approval dates, financial oversight data, and audit findings. So most of the information that is used in the monitoring selection is from Grants for Me, with very selected data points that are drawn from other sources like your performance report that is embedded in Grants for Me. Data for each SAU is entered into the monitoring selection tool, where points are assigned for each indicator. Programmatic and fiscal tools are calculated and measured against established criteria for medium and high levels of support. Each SAU is then assigned an overall monitoring level based on the highest level of support needed in either the programmatic or fiscal category. What we have here on this slide is the identification and the support levels for medium, high, as well as low. So our standard procedures for an SAU who has been identified as low requires all SAUs to submit evidence through the online grant management system, and that regular contact and support with the SAU is what is required for low identified monitoring support levels. So your application, your performance report, and any invoicing, that is all required for all SAUs, and we identify some SAUs as low monitoring status. For medium, all the requirements outlined in low level monitoring with the required additional submission of documentation in one window this year. I do know that the slide says two. That is a transfer over from last year, one window this year, and we'll talk about those changes in the very next slide. For high SAUs are required to submit documentation at the medium level, and also the additional documentation required for a high SAU. And we'll talk about each of those items at a medium and a high level momentarily. We will go through each item as a group. As I mentioned, there are some refinements that we have done from FY25's monitoring cycle to FY26 monitoring cycle. The biggest one that we should take note of is there's only one collection window. It will open on 11/1 and submissions are due on January 9th. So again, last year we had two submission windows. We have removed the two submission windows. The monitoring instrument is actually open as of today because we wanted to be sure you had access to it as we work through this training. So it's open right now, and we are requesting all of your items be submitted and complete by January 1st of 2026. You'll see that we have similar number of monitoring items, 21 items under medium and 12 will be high. So if you are an SAU that's been identified at the high level, you'll be completing documentation and evidence for 33 monitoring items. If you are an SAU at the medium level, you will be submitting evidence for 21 monitoring items. Again, last year we reinstated on-site visits, and we will continue with on-site visits, and those will be SAUs that we're visiting will be identified in April, and we will notify the SAU in March. So a few things to keep in mind as you're working through the monitoring items is you want to be sure that you're taking note of the programs that your SAU implements. So if you do not receive a title or you transfer a title into another title, you want to be sure that you're submitting evidence for the titles in which you're utilizing. Also know that if you are an SAU that engages with a non-public school, there are some requirements for equitable services and some documentation related to the non-publics within your boundary lines. So again, really having an understanding of the programs and the monitoring items that would be relevant to the programs that you're offering and the titles that you are utilizing. In addition, you want to understand the types of supports that your SAU is facilitating, particularly school-wide versus targeted programs, statuses under the Maine's model of school support, and any other supplemental multilingual programming funded by Title I and or Title III. We wanted to draw your attention to the importance of the documentation and evidence that you are submitting. Again, the due date for all documentation for all monitoring items is January 9th of 2026. If for some reason there's incomplete or non-submissions of the monitoring items, it may result in a formal letter issued to the SAU, and that letter would be sent to the roles identified on the screen. Again, these due dates are set to be sure that you folks and our team have the ability to provide information to the U.S. Department of Ed when requested. So if an incomplete or non-submission as of January 9th is not in place, there could potentially be a temporary hold on ESEA funding within the SAU until items are resolved and submitted. If you are unable to complete any of the monitoring items and the SAU has a non-submission, that will result in an on-site visit.
All right, good afternoon, folks. We're now going to transition to looking briefly at each of the monitoring items that you're going to be asked to submit. We'll give you a little bit more information on that way once you get in the instrument. It's not as foreign to you. It won't be the first time you're seeing these things. So our first set of items are kind of general ESEA requirements. These are going to be monitoring items that touch on multiple titles or kind of across the program as a whole. You'll notice all these slides are going to look very similar. On the bottom left, we're giving you an indication on if this is a medium or a high level item. I'm going to try to clarify who this item applies to and who it doesn't apply to, and some key requirements for the item. So for item A1, we talk about prioritizing your highest needs schools. This is for any folks who receive and expend their Title II or Title IV funds. So it would not be for anyone who either doesn't receive those or who transfers out all of their Title II or Title IV to another program. The requirement here is you must describe your process. It has to be data driven for determining which schools you prioritize for funding with Title II and Title IV. And you're going to provide some data to corroborate those schools. So if you said, for example, that school A had a higher poverty level or had student achievement levels that had greater need, we'd ask that you provide some evidence to demonstrate that. Item B1 deals with your application consultation. As many of you are probably aware, you fill out a page in your ESEA application every year talking about consulting with stakeholders. And so this applies to titles 1, 2, and 4. That should likely apply to everyone here in this training today. And so what we're looking for is evidence that what you listed in that application actually occurred. So that a consultation, if you said you met with students, parents, teachers, principals, etc., you have maybe some dated notes that back up when those meetings happened.
So item D1 is for any SAU that has identified non-publics within their boundary lines. The requirement is associated with timely and meaningful consultation, and the documentation and evidence that you folks would be submitting are the notes, the meeting dates, the agendas that describe what is being discussed, like the areas of high needs, the types of services that would be offered, how and where and by whom the services would be provided, and how the program would be assessed. Item E5 is associated again with non-publics, so SAUs that have non-publics within their boundary line should have an identified process in which procurement is done on behalf of the non-public school. As we know, the non-public school should not be reimbursed directly, and they are not a recipient of federal funds as the SAU. You are the legal binding entity associated with the equitable services, and the procurement must stay within the realm of the SAU. So the process, it does not have to be a policy, it has to be a procedure that you've identified in how the SAU will purchase materials on behalf of the non-public, will engage in contracts on behalf of the non-public, for professional learning, for example. So again, this evidence is a written narrative of that procedure that you're utilizing to provide those services associated with the equitable share that is generated for the non-public within the SAU boundary lines.
All right, speaking of professional learning, item C3 deals directly with professional learning. It is only for folks who are identified as needing a high level of support for monitoring. But what statute requires that professional development meet a very specific definition, that it's sustained, intensive, collaborative, job-embedded, data-driven, and classroom-focused. So this item will ask for evidence from PD that was carried out and paid for with ESEA funds, and it also applies to anyone who's identified under Maine's model of school support. So we're going to look for things like handouts, slideshows, agendas that would help demonstrate that any PD you're paying for with those federal funds meets that definition. Before one of my colleagues jumps in, one thing I did also want to mention is we will be posting these slides on our website, and you'll notice these sort of section slides all have links on them. Each of those links goes straight to a fact sheet for each item. So as you're in the monitoring process, you'll have this video to go back to, but you also have a written document that gets a little bit more details about each item and what's required of it. And I'll try to put that link directly to that part of our website in the chat as well.
Yeah, perfect, Ryan. I was just looking for it. You'll see that we have a monitoring homepage. And so like Ryan said, all of these resources will be available there, including, I think I had some questions earlier before I get into it. There's actually a whole guidance document. It's pretty formal and it's about how you're identified and sort of everything that Shelley kind of gave us the overview of earlier. So if you want to dig in and know more and the schedule and all of that, that's all going to be on our website. So yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm about to go over, Jess and I are about to go over some Title I Part A monitoring items. So like Part B folks, hold tight. You'll notice there are quite a few. If you just look at the overview of what's written on this page, a lot of it has to do with requirements in family engagement because that statute is quite specific with the notifications and the communications that are required by SAUs and schools. The other major parts of Title 1A monitoring are those big programmatic requirements that you're meeting the targeted assistance programmatic requirements if you're a targeted assistance program, and that you're meeting school-wide plan and school-wide program requirements if you're Title I school-wide programs. So item B4 is parents' right to know. It's a fancy way of saying that you, as the SAU, have communicated through a notification that parents have a right to know about teacher qualifications of any of their classroom teachers. For monitoring, I've seen it many ways. Sometimes SAUs have Title I websites that they send their parents to from either a text message or something, some news feed they may have on their homepage. So I've seen it in websites, I've seen it in handbooks, and I've seen it in formal letters and emails that go out those first 4 weeks. It's not a letter that outlines the qualifications. It's a letter that indicates that they have a right to request, and that really there should be who they request that information to. So if it's the school principal or if it's a district administrator, essentially within the first 4 weeks, you as a Title I Part A program have let your parents know they have a right to request information about their teachers. And this goes along with item B5, which is the parents' right to know about testing and testing policies that your SAU and your schools have. Sometimes I see them combined, and so that's okay if you end up uploading the same document for both. It might be helpful when we get into how you use the tool to explain things in narrative form for us to make it easier for us to understand. But this specifically is a parent's right to know about your testing policies. And sometimes I've seen SAUs who add calendars and much more information, which is great. But really this statutory requirement is, again, that you provide them the person to request assessment notification policies, whether they're state or local, and that they have the right to know and understand what is required of them when it comes to testing.
Good afternoon, everybody. Item B9 looks at the multilingual guardian outreach requirement under Title I. So this applies to any recipient that receives Title I who also provides a language instruction program, meaning you have at least one multilingual learner. So some of the big things to remember in this case is that guardian outreach must be conducted in languages parents of multilingual learners would understand. Outreach must also include how parents can be involved, how they can be active participants in the education program of their children. And then also they need to make sure that they're holding regular meetings for the purpose of formulating and responding to the recommendations coming from parents of students that are assisted under this part or under Title III.
Great. Next is item B11, timely family communication. More Title I rules here. So in this particular item, we're looking to make sure you're communicating with your parents. So depending on which model of Title I you run, that will look differently. In a targeted assistance program, we're really looking to make sure you're notifying those parents about their students being eligible for the program, on relevant information, on what the Title I program looks like. And then for the school-wide program, it's just in general how the school communicates with parents about general updates, important information. That's what we need in that particular item. The school parent compact, more family engagement requirements. So with Title I, like Rita noted, we have a lot of really specific items. The school parent compact is one of them, where you need a compact in any Title I school that clearly outlines those school level responsibilities, parent responsibilities, and explicitly talks about parent-teacher communications and expectations within that compact. We have some really great examples online. Some folks put this in handbooks, some have it as like a separate brochure type document, so it can look a couple of different ways, but that compact will need to be made and will need to be shared annually with parents. And then item E8 is supplement, not supplant. So this is for Title I Part A recipients who are not Title I exempt, which means you have only one school per grade span, one school total or one school at each grade span, or Title I neutral. So if you, for example, serve all of your elementary schools with Title I funds, then you are also exempt from this requirement. So what we're looking at here, we want to understand how funds are budgeted locally. So we're looking for some type of evidence, spreadsheet, templates, methodologies. Sometimes I've seen PowerPoints where the coordinator is presenting to the school board about local budgeting and then talking about how ESEA funds fit within that. The big thing we're watching for here is that districts are not decreasing funding to schools because they are receiving Title I funds. So we want to see what's called a Title I neutral methodology approach. So some examples of that are some schools will give a certain amount of supplies per pupil to the schools. So you'll definitely want to have collected evidence on just how your district budgets. This looks really different for different districts. So if you're getting stuck there, feel free to reach out to your regional program manager, and they'll reach out to Rita and I if they have further questions. Okay, and I believe this might be the last Title I item. This is for specifically targeted assistance schools. So for targeted assistance schools, we want to see evidence for how Title I students are selected. It should be using multiple objective, educationally related criteria. We also want to see detailed written narratives around what the program itself looks like, what curriculum is used, what, just in general, how it's structured with staffing. We want to see how students are entered into the program and how that identification process is continued throughout the year so students can exit and enter as they meet or do not meet those entrance and exit criteria. We want to see the lists of students with names redacted, and the teacher schedule, how they're servicing students. And then another piece that we've added in is, I believe last year, was how the school minimizes removal of children from the regular classroom time.
Awesome. And just clarification, that is the first high item. So we went through medium and then starting with program A2 with target assistance, that's the high item. So are the school-wide plans.
Rita, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I also just forgot to mention that that is for equitable services as well. All the private schools are running targeted programs, so we need that for all private schools who have Title I. Sorry, Rita. Thank you. Go ahead.
Perfect. So yeah, so if you're an SAU that has a non-public school with a Title I targeted assistance program, they'll be required to submit the programmatic elements of their targeted assistance program with your help. So the A6 is an updated school-wide plan. This is your North Star to having Title I school-wide flexibilities and programming. All SAUs who have schools that are Title I school-wide programs will be submitting their plans. In Maine, the template that is often used is that Comprehensive Needs Assessment SAU Consolidated Plan template. That's the long one with the data boxes and the professional practices, et cetera. So you can be submitting your most up-to-date version with that. Remember that some key requirements for school-wide plans, which is why it exists in those templates, is that it's developed with the involvement of parents and other stakeholders. It's based on the CNA, which is why we have it all in one document. Essentially, you figure out your needs, but the plan includes the activities and the goals and the evaluation aspect of the statutory requirements for school-wide programs. And so that's what goes into the next bullet there, description of strategies the school will implement. And then there are key subgroups, and I'm seeing that more and more of you are really thoughtfully considering your multilingual learners, especially as they increase in population in many districts across the state. Your economically disadvantaged students, of course, as you're probably in a high poverty school there with your school-wide program, students from major racial and ethnic groups, and special education students. So taking a look at those, their data, how they're doing, evaluating your school-wide programs, and ensuring every year that you've updated your plans accordingly. Item B6, so you thought we were done with family engagement. This is a high item, but this is essentially for all Title I Part A participants, recipients again. And this is really about the effort that SAUs in school make to receive feedback. So there are obviously required notices and required communications that you kind of check off to make sure you've done this. Well, this is much more of that reciprocal relationship that you form with your parents in your school district. Do you have surveys? Do you have exit slips? Do you ask them and compile data from the parent-teacher conferences? Essentially, how are you gathering feedback from your families to ensure that your programs, your Title I targeted or school-wide programs, are meeting the needs of the students and the families? And it's going to look different. Parent and family feedback looks different. So we take a wide variety of evidence for this particular item, but we should be seeing the effort and the solicitation of their feedback and their opinions and comments on the programs. This one has to do with parental notification of academic progress. So it's your report cards, your quarterly progress reports. With targeted assistance, I've seen sometimes they're kind of one document. Please, no student names. If you can redact any personal information, please, please, please. We don't need to see that. We essentially just need to see that parents are being notified of their children's progress.
All right, item B8 talks about the parental notifications of multilingual status. So again, this applies to any district who receives Title I Part A funds who also have at least one multilingual learner. Some of the big things to keep in mind that this is something that has to go out within 30 days, the beginning of the school year. And there are a list of requirements when it comes to what needs to be included in this notification, such as the reason for identification, the level of English language proficiency, the instructional methods used in the program, how the program will meet the multilingual learners' needs, the exit requirements, and then information pertaining to parental rights, specifically around special education.
And this is the last high item for family engagement in Title I. This is your KBF policy, your SAU, and/or if you have school level family engagement policies, and any evidence of activities that follow those policies. It's always important to note, I know with school boards, sometimes it takes 5-10 years to update policies. But it's very important for school leadership and for district level leadership to realize that that is kind of another North Star of family engagement with Title I is that policy and that policy is followed. So take a look at your most recent one that you have and check that you're following based on that policy. You're actually doing the things that is outlined and provide that evidence for this item. Now I'm going to get into Title I Part D requirements as we have facility being monitored for Title I Part D. They're all going to be in medium level, and there are 4 items specifically for Title I Part D. And for those that don't know what that title is, it is for our neglected and delinquent youth in Maine. So item A3, a major part of Title I Part D is transitioning students because they will be living, whether they've been adjudicated by the court system, whether they're asked to go to a facility, whether it be Long Creek or some of our NFI North satellite facilities. It's really important that that facility is demonstrating the program provides transition services, as it is a requirement in the budget. And these are, of course, strategies to help students toward continued education, internships, CTE programs, employment, or even back to their SAU in their attendance area. Evidence is also going to be wide-ranging, but it's essentially seeing those transition service providers, those plans, and any student work or other data that will be of evidence that they are transitioning out of the facility. Another major part of Title I Part D is that it doesn't require annual evaluation, but it requires once every 3 years at least. So this is one of those pieces of evidence, and I would say even effective practices for facilities to really get into a rhythm of, which is to evaluate how the program is working. Are students able to recover credits? Are they able to work towards their GED? Are they able to find transitional services and or opportunities in the facility? So again, very important to have evidence that shows that you look at your whole program holistically, you see the outcomes of your students, and you take a look to determine what that might mean for changing programming or changing contracted services, et cetera, to meet the needs of the students. Statutorily, the data should be disaggregated to look at race and gender and age, depending on, of course, the makeup of the facility and the amount of students. And notes and agenda or any meeting minutes from when these programs are evaluated and looked at will be evidence that will be accepted. And item A7 is curricular alignment, again, because you're a facility housing adjudicated youth. It's important that whatever academic services they are being provided align with Maine state standards. And last but not least, family engagement. It is also part of Title I Part D. It is not anywhere as specific or as robust as Title I Part A. However, because again, these students are living in the facility, their relationship with their family and embedding their family to understand how they're doing and to help them transition out of the facility, it's important that the facility is taking extra effort to engage parents. So this can be documentation that provides of communications or events that were hosted, as well as any written narrative about what that facility does in order to improve educational achievement for the children or youth.
All right, now we're going to look at Title II Part A monitoring items, and there are only 2 of them we need to talk about. So item C1 is for class size reductions. This is for any SAU that utilizes Title IIA specifically for a class size reduction project. If you don't, then this item would be not applicable for you. 2 things we look for. The first is just documenting the class size before and after the class size reduction. Just going to prove it was an evidence-based practice. And the second thing that's required is that the teacher hired for that class size reduction project has to be considered effective. So we're going to look for some sort of evidence that the SAU used to determine the teacher was effective. So this might be their past evaluations, or it might be notes from an interview process. Either way, like Rita mentioned, we do not want to see personal data. Please, if you can, plaque those names out because this is, your employment data is protected, but we just need to see that you had some sort of way to determine this person was effective before hiring them for class size reduction. And our second item, related to one we had earlier where we talked about consulting with all your stakeholders, but specifically item C2 talks about collaboration in terms of your professional development specifically. So this is for any SAU that utilizes Title IIA for PD purposes. If you transfer your Title II out or don't use it for PD, let's say you only used it for class size reduction, then C2 would not apply. So looking for evidence that you did include all of those stakeholders and that there's a connection between what the stakeholders said was a need for PD in your school and what was actually carried out. So one common example, we see a lot of SAUs do a survey at the end of the year with their teachers about what PD they want to see in the next school year. So we look at the survey results and let's say top response was MTSS. We'd want to see on your district's PD calendar one day dedicated at least to MTSS, right? There's a line between what your stakeholders said was needed and what's actually being carried out.
All right, we're going to go into some Title III monitoring items. There's only 2 of them, similar to Title II. So the first one is A8, which is talking about family engagement. This specifically applies to any SAU that receives Title III Part A funds. So if your SAU does not receive Title III funds, then this would be considered an NA. If you do not receive Title III funds, but you have multilingual learners, it still does not apply to you. So only if you receive Title III funds. Some of the big takeaways on this one, making sure that you provide evidence of parent, family, and community engagement. Statute is very clear that this is an and, it's not an or. So community engagement is a requirement for Title III. So this can also include some narrative of how those activities enhanced or supplemented the language instruction program, and some examples, attendance sheets, exit slips, feedback forms, survey results, etc. Item C4, very similar to the Title II, where we're looking at effective professional development. Again, this is specific to Title III. So again, if your SAU does not receive Title III funds, this is considered an NA. The big takeaways here, making sure that the SAU shows evidence of funding activities that meet the definition of that evidence-based professional development. And then we need to make sure that it's also corresponding with the areas of high need that have been identified in the comprehensive needs assessment that is done annually.
So now we're going to jump into some of the fiscal requirements. You can see that there's 4 medium items and 2 high items. Again, just a reminder, if you are identified as a medium level, you would provide evidence for the top 4. If you are a high SAU, you would provide evidence for all 6 items. The first one, E1, is about management of the ESEA federal funds. So any SAU who receives any of the title programs and the school improvement funds would be required to provide evidence, and the evidence would indicate your federal award, how much was received, how much was expended, being sure that the expenses are aligned to the source of funding, so particular title or school improvement funds. Again, a note to keep in mind is this year's fiscal monitoring requirement and evidence will be from last fiscal year. So we want to be sure that the fiscal year has closed out. So in January, you would be submitting documentation from FY25 in your FY26 monitoring cycle. We've provided some descriptions or some examples of what that evidence might be. So you can see on the top left-hand corner, It's clearly marked as a Title I expenditure. You can see there's dates. We want to be sure that there's enough information to identify the source, the expense, and when the expense was transpired. The medium item E2 is related to your travel policy. We want to be sure that this travel policy is independent of the teacher's contract. So really refining the information in that written policy about lodging, meals, mileage, and rate of reimbursement. E4 is related to time and effort. So if staff is paid in part or whole using any federal funds, then time and effort documentation must be maintained per the administrative regulations. So big takeaways is certification of time, having documentation that states something to the effect of I am being paid 100% with Title I ESEA funds, having that dated after the work has been conducted, along with a supervisor's signature is really important. This is the type of documentation that we are looking for that illustrates the cost objective that the employee is working on and the percentage of time on that cost objective. E7 is related to written procurement standards. So the SAU must have and use the documented procurement procedures consistent with state, local, and other regulations associated with acquiring property and equipment. So you want to be sure that the documentation you have, you illustrate the process and the procedure, and that you are following that process and procedure when making purchases or contracting for goods and services. E3 is related to staff code of conduct. So the non-federal entity must have a written standard of conduct conveying conflicts of interest and governing the actions of its employees engaged in this selection, award, and administration of contracts. So we want to see documentation associated with an understanding from an employee and the SAU that denotes that they're not participating in any agreements that might be confrontational, against the bias of the organization, and have any favoritism associated with procurement standards. E6 is related to the equipment policy and procedures. Again, anything that is tangible, including the infrastructure, technology infrastructures, must have a process that is followed in regards to how they are purchased and inventoried. We'll provide you with some documentation of how that inventory and that collection of this data might be maintained. So you can see here that there's some information associated with the serial number. Each item is given a unique number. So on your device, on the equipment itself, you'll have a denotation that this item is associated with this line within the inventory. So this should have a policy, but also the fiscal collection of that evidence as well.
So we're now to school improvement requirements. And so there are 3 identification statuses for school improvement. There's ATSI, TSI, and CSI. And I think we can go to the next slide. So if you have any schools in your SAU that have been identified for ATSI, which is additional targeted school improvement, then you will be required to submit a school improvement plan that meets the ATSI requirements. And the big takeaways are that this plan needs to be, one, it needs to be at the school level. And what I found is that plans that I received last year for monitoring were written at the district level. Each school has to have their own school improvement plan, and it needs to be developed in partnership with the principal, other school leaders, teachers, and parents. It needs to be informed by all the indicators in Maine's model school supports, which is what MMSS is. It needs to include evidence-based interventions, and they need to be the level 1 or 2. Anything that's less than that does not meet the requirements. Identify resource inequities that are addressed through the implementation of the school improvement plan, and be reviewed, approved, and monitored by the school and the SAU. And if it results in an additional action following unsuccessful implementation of the plan. And then the next slide is targeted school improvement. So if you have any schools that are TSI, then you need to make sure that you have a targeted school improvement plan. And most of these are the same requirements that are for the ATSI plan. The only difference is that you don't need to have, you don't need to do a resource or identified resource inequities, but it still needs to be developed in partnership with the principal, other school leaders, teachers, and parents. It needs to be informed by all indicators in the Maine's model school supports. It needs to include evidence-based interventions, be reviewed, approved, and monitored by the school and SAU, and results in additional action following unsuccessful implementation of the plan. And then the next level is comprehensive support and improvement, which is CSI. And a lot of the requirements are already embedded in the school improvement grant. CSI schools do receive additional funds, Section 1003 funds. And so there's certain requirements that we monitor through the application and Grants for Me, but then there's others that we will look at through this ESEA monitoring. And those are, what is the process for how resource inequities were identified and addressed through the implementation of the school improvement plan? The process for how other federal, state, and local resources were aligned to carry out activities in the school improvement plan. How did the SAU modify practices to provide operational flexibility, enabling the full and effective implementation of the school improvement plan, and evidence that the school received all federal and local funds outside of the Section 1003 funds that were provided to them through the school improvement grant, or what we call the SIG grant and Grants for Me.
Great. And as we mentioned earlier, and I think Ryan popped the link in the chat, I can do that again as well, just because I feel like this for many of you might be really helpful webpage to go back to. You'll see that monitoring guidance is there. Once the video and the PDF are available, it will be of this training, not last year's. Currently, that's last year's training up with the 2 windows. Many of the items are the same, but we'll update that so that you have a recording of this online. And then some monitoring instrument training. And Ryan's about to do a live demo as well. So we'll have that available on the website. And below on the same page are all those fact sheets for every individual item.
So we're just about ready to close sort of the informational portion of our presentation for today, and then we will go into a demo of the monitoring instrument on Grants for Me. So just a few things to keep in mind as we move into this next step of the process. All SAUs were informed in August of their monitoring level status, and if you want to remind yourself and your SAU of that level, you can find it on the ESEA grant award notifications and Grants for Me. As I mentioned earlier, the instrument is already open in advance of our November 1st timeline. We wanted to be sure that you had the instrument open for you folks to be able to join us in today's training. So we opened the monitoring instrument on October 16th. All items and evidence will need to be submitted by January 9th of 2026. We as a team will take the next few weeks to review all of the items submitted from our SAUs, and we will provide feedback to the SAUs by February 25th of 2026. SAUs will be notified by March 11th if they are an SAU that has been selected for an on-site visit. We will conduct those on-site visits in April. They will consist of a member from the ESEA team and a partner in regards to the on-site visit. By May 15th of 2026, all corrective actions on behalf of the SAUs must be completed, and it is our hope to be able to close FY26 monitoring cycle at that time in advance to the end of your school year. The team has done a wonderful job in monitoring the chat box and providing responses to your questions. But if you're looking for some additional information, the website for the monitoring, our ESEA monitoring, was posted in the chat box. But if you're looking for something related to the department, these are our avenues in which you can take a look to see what we are doing as the Maine Department of Education.